Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking with Dr. Jakie King. Jakie has a background as a lawyer, but it seems like her passion is really around training and education and some really interesting ways of thinking around conflict and conflict resolution. So I'll hand over to you, Jakie. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I'm really curious about how your background's brought you to where you are at the moment.
As you mentioned, I'm a lawyer by training and had a very early career in the law and quickly moved to academia, where I got involved in refugee advocacy and did my PhD on policy in the refugee space and refugee issues at that time in the late 90s were very divisive socially and politically, and got me into the world of advocacy and understanding otherness. And that has been a theme throughout my personal life and my career is reconciling different others. And over the course of my career, I have intuitively engaged in advocacy for underdogs and those less served and less visible, but also seen in the workplace how conflict can really affect the operations and the culture of an organization. And so earlier this year, I decided to bring all of my practical experience together through the mediation course to become a qualified mediator.
Wonderful. I'm really interested in that term otherness and that concept of othering. Do you want to, just for anyone who's not as familiar with the concept?
So, of course, so the notion of other actually comes from political science, which is what I studied and what I did my PhD in. And it's around difference. It's usually used in a social context, in the context of political identity. And it actually was entirely fascinating for me during my undergraduate, and it still is. And I've just published a book on otherness called The Ultimate Other, where I use design thinking to understand myself, design thinking being a framework for innovation and for solving problems, both in communities, in businesses. And I've applied that to the personal, reconciling my own identities as I rebuilt my life after my divorce. And otherness is a notion of difference. It's a way of thinking about yourself and the world that means that you stand apart.
And I imagine when you came and did your mediation training, that concept of otherness, maybe with different language, but came through.
It jumped out at me, and I've been thinking a lot since then around how design thinking, which is the premise of my book, and how mediation takes conflict and uses otherness as a means of identifying interests. And in the world as we know it right now, that is a skill that's very much needed, especially in the workplace, and something that I would like to focus on moving forward, and that I'd like to use my book as a platform for.
That's so true. And it's such an important thing for us to be talking about in this time because there's so much polarization, so little tolerance and acceptance. They sound like bad words, but for me as a mediator, they're actually, I think they're really good things that we accept, particularly difference rather than trying to change people's beliefs and values and interests. It's
Exactly. And I think that values based conflict is going to come more and more into the foray of mediation. So I thought perhaps I might take you through the five main stages of design thinking, align them with the stages of mediation as I learnt them in the
oh,
book.
that'd be fascinating. I'm sure everyone's sitting up listening.
It's really been interesting to try and draw parallels between the two. So if you're okay, I might just give a brief
Yeah, no,
introduction.
that'd be great. Let's talk through now.
All right. I'll use the design thinking as the base. So the first stage of design thinking and actually to resolution, conflict resolution across all domains really is around empathy. And that's the premise of my work as well. And so empathy for yourself, either as a participant in mediation and then to have the ability to empathize for the other. doing the opening statements and the pre-work that's required by a mediator, understanding the interests of the parties, empathy, I think, is absolutely crucial. So from design thinking, we look at the users or the stakeholders and their needs. But in mediation, we understand their emotions, their concerns, how they're feeling, what impact various events have had on them, and trying to create an environment in both cases where parties feel heard and validated, built in trust. So that's the first stage. The second stage of design thinking is really defining the problem. And I would say that's when we develop the agenda and try to get to the bottom of what are the actual issues that are concerns, because often when conflict continues, we associate the emotional feelings of dislike or distrust with the individual rather than what they're actually standing for in an objective way. Defining the problem or developing the agenda and asking how might we solve this problem is the same in both frameworks. And we then ideate into design thinking. We don't worry about money. We don't worry about resources. We do blue sky thinking. What are all the alternatives? What are the solutions? And so brainstorming creative solutions. And of course, in mediation, we ask the parties to propose a range of possible solutions and trying to find points of collaboration. And we're looking at underlying needs and interests rather than kind of surface level resolutions, and looking at the best possible outcome and the worst possible outcome. And design thinking goes through all those processes as well. Of course, then we have a prototype in design thinking, and in mediation we agree on it's something to test, and where we develop a tangible kind of vision of what a solution, a agreed solution might be. So that would be in mediation, crafting preliminary agreements or action plans and the steps that are required to make those happen. In design thinking, we then test, we see what works, what doesn't, and we iterate. In mediation, during the mediation process, which we have the 5 Ws, we reality check, we refine, and then we commit. And so I think if in that broad sense, you know, by utilizing design thinking principles, we can create a really empathetic process that leads to good outcomes for parties involved, because it's really a human-centered approach.
Yeah. And the thing is, with that last stage, it's not always done as well as it could be, but there's nothing to prevent a review session after mediation, which is really what
Iteration or a check-in.
yeah, check in the workplace, a review in a family, parenting plan agreement to see, because, you know, you're never 100% guaranteed that what you think is going to work as expected in that moment when you're making those decisions.
Absolutely.
So really, I think applying that framework is really powerful to remind us as mediators what we are doing is designing a new reality with these people, a new future. And there is a framework that's really well proven both in mediation and within other contexts around the stages. That's very interesting. And you said you've written a book.
Available on Amazon. It's called The Ultimate Other. And yes, please feel free to purchase it. And it's really to apply empathy to yourself and to align various elements of your own identities. My belief is that hard work needs to be done before you're in a position to help others engage in their own empathetic processes and be open to hearing other stories or understanding other emotions or motivations or concerns of people who might be involved in a situation that requires resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's critical, because if we don't do that as mediators, we run the risk of unconsciously aligning or rejecting.
And that's what builds trust as well. And if you want to take it out to a broader program of opportunity, the empathy and the trust that is required in listening to other perspectives is really what the basis of social cohesion is. So if you want to take it out to a societal level, in my view, it's really the beginning of that process of building social cohesion at a time where trust is diminishing and social cohesion and polarization are not where we want them to be.
Absolutely. I was just imagining that. I was thinking the same thing. So going from the individual out to the group and to the society. So is that scope that you've got in your book that expands?
No, the scope is really around my own experiences, but using the book as a platform to delve into those broader societal issues, yes, that's absolutely something I'm investigating at the moment. And I'm really open to conversations with organisations who are interested in social cohesion and value conflict resolution in their workplace, and empathy for individuals. And yes, I would be very grateful if people could reach out to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a huge need and there's real potential. One of the organisations I'm involved with in our community dispute resolution service, and very much working around that community conflict, and work with organisations that work within specific communities. It sounds like your background has given you quite a few insights around that othering and racism and all of those isms that divide us as well.
Absolutely. I've been involved in multicultural communities for a very long time. I sit on a multicultural disability organisation called ADEC, and I'm on the Southeastern Regional Advisory Committee for the Multicultural Commission of Victoria, and I had my own experiences of cultural identity that have very much formed my understanding of otherness.
And I think you mentioned around the inner critic and even going in narrower than the individual is the othering within ourselves, like not accepting parts of ourselves.
That's exactly right. There's certainly a gender lens applied to that part of the story. And I think everybody applies to themselves at different points in time, but evidence shows it's particularly prominent amongst a particular age of women. So yes, there's been a lot of work done in understanding that and managing that as I put myself out into the world.
It's really important. I was looking at the data around separation and divorce and that sort of mid-40s type age group where a lot of women are really coming into themselves, and it creates friction within relationships if we haven't got the skills to manage those changes. So I'm not sure if that's an area you're focused on yet, or one that you will in the future. But
I've gone through my own personal journey. I think that workplaces are really the crux of what people spend most of their time at work. People take on their identity and social licenses of the organisations that they work for. So I think this piece around empathy and otherness and social cohesion is really important in various workplaces, but your personal circumstances, your choice of partner, the cultural context in which you live and identify all adds up to who you see yourself as and how the world sees you. And I think we're all better for doing a little bit of work on ourselves in that process.
absolutely. And I've got to quote something that you said, that we generally have more in common with others than not. And we can use design thinking to tap into that. So that empathy and recognition and seeing the commonalities that we have below the surface, is that part of the premise of what you're...
I think that's where we need to start. That's the assumptions we need to make from the beginning. Instead of assuming that we have less in common, we generally have more in common as people. Being able to tell good stories, being able to listen, and being open enough to hear what the other people are saying in your personal life and in your work life and in your community life is, I think, increasingly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the point of view of mediation, that's a really important part of what we're trying to do, because we know when people are in conflict, they start automatically to dehumanize the other person. They're doing this because they're bad and mean and they're trying to whatever. Anything I do is because of the pressures I'm under. And when we can help them to see the other person is similarly under pressures.
That's exactly right. And I think that's the difference between moving from a positionist and disassociating the individual from the issue that you're trying to deal with.
Yeah.
And once you take that out of the equation, you might have a different view.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if we can take that polarized lens off and really help people to listen to what the other's got to say instead of their assumptions, it can make so much of a difference. And I guess that's a little bit of a difference between what we try and do in mediation to the more positional bargaining type approaches that are traditional done in that more legalistic approach, where it's almost as if the people are a byproduct of the issue rather than central.
That's right. And I think that this approach, that I call it mediation by design almost, also equally applies to team conflict, although there's more work that needs to be done within the team, and especially if there are groups of people who have taken sides in a conflict. But it's a very similar process. It's just that you need to understand the emotions and the motivations and the concerns of all the team members, not just individual parties. And there are lots of different ways that you can do that through small group discussions to uncover the deeper issues beneath what might otherwise seem like surface level disputes, and creating a safe, brave, non-judgmental environment for communication, for agency, and for psychological safety.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And using the framework of a mediator facilitated process, it gives that confidentiality as well. And as you said, the opportunity where people can be brave enough to be honest and open about what's going on. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? What I'm hearing is you got this background, you were working with these groups, you went through your own personal experience that's led you to where you are now. And
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The book for me was really a cathartic experience. And I am looking at and would love to speak to people, collaborate on different ways of bringing design thinking into organizations to help them resolve all kinds of conflict. And because I think it is a really effective tool, and at this time of heightened political identity tension, I'll call it. And I think that it is something that could really help organizations understand their employees, but also help their employees understand each other.
yeah, but that's what I'm getting, that it's a much more proactive approach, where often what I'm seeing in organizations that issues or tensions arise and the first go-to tool is an investigation. So someone must be at fault. Often there isn't anyone particularly at fault. And so then they call in the mediators, and we're supposed to bring together a couple of people and make it all go away. It can be quite superficial, where what I'm hearing from you is ideally before the tensions get to the point of accusation, how would someone identify that it might be good to, or you're talking about introducing this as just normal part of culture management?
I think I'd like to see that part of, the BAU of every organisation. But I think the kinds of things that we would be looking for would be absenteeism from a certain cultural group, or increasing complaints, or a shift in tangible culture, like how people feel about coming to work, increased visibility and prevalence of identity-based symbols, keychains, badges, bags, clothing that might suggest political. Not that there's anything wrong with that. People are free to bring their whole selves to work. I think the question is how we ensure that everybody feels safe, and the notion of diversity actually be respected rather than it be just a superficial tick box. That's particularly true in Victoria, where new anti-racism and new psychosocial risk-related legislation is coming through with positive duty for employees to ensure that these things are embedded and meaningful and not sure. And that's a very hard thing for organisations to do, to try and capture what everybody on their teams might need. So this is one way to understand the landscape better.
That was really clear. That really identified the sorts of things that may be worrying managers, HR managers, and not really knowing, what do I do? How do I get help with this? So you've got a LinkedIn profile, Jakie King. People can find you there. Look up Jakie, Jacie King, on Facebook or LinkedIn, and they'll be able to connect with you or get in touch and we'll put you in contact. So how do you work with an organisation? Someone hears this and thinks, yes, we've been seeing that. I know that some groups of our organisation are feeling uncomfortable. How would they work with you? What would you?
I would have to do a deep dive into what their understanding of the problem was and then talk to various people within the institution about their perspectives. It always has to be co-design because everybody's situation is different, and that's the beauty of design thinking. I would not presume to know the ins and outs of a business. I also think that the alignment with the strategic plan and then cascading to service delivery operations, they're all really crucial elements in how people feel about coming to work. And so they're the conversations I would start with, as well as looking at what currently exists in their policy banks and their frameworks and working with them, with their people, either in groups or one-on-one, but also in terms of their strategic and policy and regulatory evolutions as well. I do have a website. It's www.drjackieking.com.au, and that might be the best way to reach out to me.
Perfect. Yeah. So www.drjackieking.com.au.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you. Before I got involved in mediation, I used to work in process improvement. And as you were speaking, I was saying, thank you. Because, yeah, you don't come in and impose something on top. You find out there's usually where there's problems, there's the problems with either the policies or the implementation. And you spoke about looking at all of that to see where
design asks what are people's pain points and what are their needs.
Yeah.
And so that would be trends from which I start those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, what's your environment? Where do you live? What's surrounding you? Because sometimes inadvertently the drivers of these problems are within the organisation.
Absolutely. Sometimes they are and sometimes they don't change, but we can change how we feel about them.
Yeah, absolutely. The meaning we make. And that's often 9/10 of the process of resolving something is getting an understanding of the meaning. So we're taking and clearing up misunderstandings there.
That's exactly right. And the human response to things is what design thinking is really all about.
That's wonderful. I'm so looking forward to delving more of your work and what you've been working on now. One of the things you mentioned that you'd like to start doing, getting a little bit more visibility for your book and your approach. So you're available to do talks and things like that as well.
Absolutely. I would welcome that.
So that's something if people think, oh, wow, that sounds a bit big, you might be able to do a bit of a talk for the organisation, help them to understand a little bit more about the big picture before they are willing or able to delve into the detail. And that's as far as we got in the interview because technology failed us and we weren't able to proceed any further. But if you are interested in the work that Jakie's doing, as we mentioned, her book is The Ultimate Hubber, and you can find out more on her website, www.drjackieking.com.au. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Mediator Musings. Until next time, I'm Joanne Law from Mediation Institute.